So, history of Christianity, more bloody or less bloody if Jesus was more like Muhammad?
In the 2000s, I started to think, if somebody came along and declared prophethood at the moment, they could do quite well.
Douglas claims that just because you've lost the religion doesn't mean you've lost the religious instinct. If you take Christianity out, and other things will be put in.
I wonder if it's the same with societies. I think that it's a thing like post-religious peoples. Just because you've lost the religion doesn't mean you've lost the religious instinct.
Right.
You're still looking for it.
It seems like that's an inherent part of being a person.
I agree, and I don't say it's bad. It's just it is part of what we are, and it seems to me very clear that, for instance, you take Christianity out and other things will be put in. And they don't even need to be identifiable religions.
Douglas believes that there's this sort of form of watered-down spillover of Christianity.
I mean, our own age has decided in much of the West that there's this sort of form of watered-down spillover of Christianity which will become the sort of religion, which is the kind of diversity, inclusion, equity world where you constantly struggle for greater justice, all of which is a sort of very watered-down version of a little bit of Christianity.
Joe Rogan believes that there's a clear genesis in the woke world.
There's a clear genesis of that, too, in the woke world. There was a group at a certain point in time. Do you remember when the atheist movement had hit this Atheist Plus movement? Do you remember Atheism Plus?
What was that?
Joe Rogan talks about the rise of the Atheist Plus movement. This movement promotes being anti-discrimination and anti-racist as new forms of belief.
It was weird, and it was a bunch of these weird virtue-signaling male feminist types that were adding, with atheism, adding a group of core values.
Oh, wow.
About, being anti-racist.
Their own 10 Commandments.
Yes. And so they called it Atheism Plus. And I remember watching this guy give this speech, this boring speech, on this sort of establishing this idea that because you don't have a religion, so we're going to be atheists, but with plus, we can establish sort of a moral framework.
Well, it's totally understandable and a disaster, of course.
Even if the ideas are good, it's like you're putting it in an ideology. You're creating a dogma. You're creating
all those new atheists who sort of started off in the 2000s, like our friend Sam Harris and others. They, in my experience, they all got a little bit nervous about what was on their shoulders. Christopher Hitchens certainly did. He started, I think, latterly in his life to get a little bit nervous about what was happening. I remember once asking him what about it. He said people were starting to ask him to officiate at their weddings.
Oh,
yeah, and that was like he didn't say anything of what he said was wrong. He still obviously believed everything he believed, but like that's a slightly troubling place to be in because you start to sense people are wanting you to replace the vicar or the priest, and that's like not the point. Then you're in Life of Brian territory, aren't you? It's like, I want, you should all think for yourselves. Yes, we all think for ourselves. It was always a problem of atheism, was like it was an invitation to not do one thing.
Yeah.
But nothing follows from it as to how you should live your life. It's the start of something. It's not by any means a beginning of a policy.
Do you think that's just an inherent thing about being a tribal primate, that we have this desire to have someone wiser, a leader, and then even better if you can have like a godlike figure who gives you a set of rules that you have to follow, or they're horrendous consequences and it keeps everyone in line?
Yeah, absolutely.
Douglas claims there are still people who see themselves as prophets.
In the 2000s, I started to think, if somebody came along and declared prophethood at the moment, they could do quite well. I mean, think of those hucksters on US television who still take money from people, saying that they can only build the church and have their helicopter if you send in your dollars, those people still exist. There's a guy who's still selling his like silver water that he blesses from the River Jordan or something. It comes out some hose in his garden in Texas. Yeah. And there are people who've been busted repeatedly, and they're still selling their wares. I always thought, if somebody actually made the prophet claim in our era, I think people would be surprised how many people would go along with it. It's the late George Steiner described. A phrase I love, nostalgia for the absolute. I love that phrase, a nostalgia for the absolute. I think a lot of people have it. I have it. We all have it to some extent. And the question is whether you can avoid it taking you to places that would demoralize you and lead you to a bad place.
He questions the assertion that our basic shared ethics are self-evident.
It's not a secret, that having been said, I was born and brought up a Christian, as a believing Christian, from I think most of my life, including through my adult life. And I'm now in, I suppose, a self-confessedly conflicted, complex situation of being, among other things, an uncomfortable agnostic who recognizes the values and the virtues that the Christian faith has brought. I think I sort of laid out how I think our civilization, our culture has got to the stage that it is at the moment and its current uncomfortable relationship with faith. I tried to lay that out in Strange of Europe. I still believe what I wrote there was accurate as a diagnosis of the era. But it's a very uncomfortable, as I say, position that someone like me is in, because I say, there has been a period of rejection of faith, particularly from what in our lifetimes has been known as the New Atheist movement, which made claims that were self-confessedly wrong. That, for instance, actually I think of a late friend of both Tom Wright's and mine, Rabbi Jonathan Sachs, once said, that the claim that, for instance, morality was obvious was obviously wrong. The claim that basic ethics that we might share are self-evident is self-evidently not the case. One doesn't have to be an ethicist to know that. You just need to travel. You just need to read, look and listen, and to know that's the case. So there has, in my view, I think we spoke about this before, Justin, that there has, in my view, been an interesting movement in recent years, which I think Tom Holland, who you mentioned earlier, is certainly an example of people saying, actually, if we go back and look at this, what we have and what we like does have roots in this, in the Christian story. Now, the follow-on question from there, I suppose, is, well, what do we do about it? And I think that a great failing of our time has been the tendency to talk past each other on this. The religious tend to say, well, it's easy, you just have to believe. If you recognize these virtues and values, then believe. And doesn't take into account the fact that very many people today, it is harder than that, for all sorts of reasons we could go into. But I would just make one other observation, which is that even outside of faith, I have an added discomfort, which is the discomfort of a non-believer who is disappointed by the behavior of a believing church. Now, many people think that that's paradoxical, but it isn't at all.
Based on his experience, Douglas observes many churches evolving into something else.
Not only was brought up in, but afterwards sought the church as it has been in England, and its jewels and gems of the King James Bible, the Book of Common Prayer, and much more. And it's been my experience, as it has been for many other people brought up in recent decades and last century and more, that one has observed the church giving up its jewels and becoming something else. And actually, that irritation I feel from the outside, albeit from the outside at the moment, that irritation I feel about the church hasn't gone away even whilst being outside it. A fear, it comes back to that article that provoked Tom Wright's excellent letter. My fear is constantly the church is not doing what so many of us on the outside would like it to do, which is to be preaching its gospel, to be asserting its truths and its claims. And so when one sees it falling into all of the latest tropes one just thinks, well, that's another thing gone. It's just like absolutely everything else in the era. Everything in this boring, monotone, ill thought out and shallow dialectic. And so as I say, I'm a disappointed non-adherent. You can't wish things you know and wish them unknown, or wish them unlearned. And this is something I think is very important in all dialogue between believers and non-believers. I just wanted to say, I wouldn't like it to be anyone to take away from this that I simply think that the church has a PR problem. It isn't just that I think that the presentation is wrong, or that there's a mistake in, for instance, falling into the religion of anti-racism or anything else. It's that I do believe that doing that means that the church fails to tell its own story. We had an article in the Spectator, I think last week, from my friend.
He believes it's not just a PR misunderstanding, but a missed opportunity within the church.
He made a very powerful point about the figures in the church, for instance, who were profoundly anti, and not just Wilberforce, but Charlemagne and others who saints in the 7th century, Christian saints in the 7th century, who were martyred and objected to the in their own time. There is, what I'm trying to say is that it's not just that there's a PR misunderstanding, it seems to me, within the church, and it's missing a trick. It is that this is not a fair summary of the Christian story. It isn't a fair summary of the story of the church. And what it is the adoption of a facile and profoundly hostile analysis of the church, which sees the church, for instance, as being a white enterprise. But it clearly isn't. Like Tom Wright has seen congregations across the world. I've been at services throughout the Middle East, across Africa. Beleaguered communities sometimes show absolutely extraordinary and inspiring levels of faith. And I don't recognize the negative interpretation of the church, which I see from some people trying to force a different ethic on the church today. But as I say, it's not just in the history of the church, but in the story that the church has to tell about itself today that I think that there is an error being made. Because, for instance, to go back to something which, as Tom Wright knows, I wrote about in The Madness of Crowds, if you look at the great error of the ideology which is trying to embed today, it is that it has spent no time bothering itself over the question of forgiveness. Now, it's not just that I think that the church is missing a PR trick in not addressing this. I think that the church does everybody in society the most enormous disservice if it doesn't say, this is what our faith is built upon. We have been thinking about this and trying to practice it, at least, for millennia. So at least give us your ear for a moment.
Douglas shares his perspective on Christians and his beliefs.
Well, it means I'm not a believer in God, or at least I find it very hard to believe in God. I'd say maybe agnostic is better. But obviously I'm a Christian because I was born in a Christian civilization, a Christian country, and brought up a Christian. So, I mean, there are people who lose their faith or don't have faith and are Jewish or Muslim, but that's not the same thing as a Christian atheist. I just think it's absurd not to concede the fact that much of what we have in America, like Britain, Canada, is derived from Christian ethics, right? Christian ideas. And why deny that? I mean, you might not believe it, but you shouldn't deny it because it's obvious. I mean, what are human rights but a kind of derivation of a form of spilt Christianity? Right. There's no reason to have human rights. They're not self-evident.
No.
So I think that, you should just concede these things where they're true, and even if they're against your interests, and obviously for atheists it's against their interests very often, but nevertheless. And I also say that it's important to concede this because you should try to work out, I think, whether you want to engage in sawing off a branch of a tree that you're sitting on.
He speculates how Christianity's history might have been different if Jesus were more like Muhammad.
What is one of the greatest moments in Christian scripture, but the moment when Jesus has brought to him the woman who is caught in adultery. And what does Jesus say when the crowd wanted to stone her for her sins? He says, "He who is without sin cast the first stone." And the crowd go away. Now, in the Islamic tradition, a very, very similar thing happens when a woman is brought to Muhammad and he has her stoned. So, history of Christianity, more bloody or less bloody if Jesus was more like Muhammad?
Douglas underscores the belief that all men are equal because they are created equal by God.
I think everyone would say likely to be more bloody. There are enlightened traditions within certain Muslim traditions, certain ones. They tend, by the way, to be highly prejudiced against by other Muslims. I'm thinking of things like the Ahmadiyya community, certain branches of Sufi Islam, which have very admirable attitudes towards enlightenment and a sort of syncretic belief of their own. But these are minority sects within Islam and are largely hated by other Muslims. Islam is about subjugation to Allah. And that's why one of the reasons why the Muslim world is as it is. The Christian world is as it is because of the legacy of Christianity. I mean, it's from Christianity that we get the idea of rights. Why do I say that? Because even the framers of the European Constitution pretty much knew this. Certainly the framers of the UN Declaration on Human Rights knew this. Certainly the founding fathers of the United States knew this. That the reason why all men are regarded as equal is because all mankind is created equal by God. And that people may be different in their lives, and we're all different in our lives, and you may be a car mechanic or a king, but that we're all the same. We're all the same in the eyes of God, in the eyes of the Creator. Nobody to that extent has the ability to be, is by nature better or worse than anyone else. It's the adventure of their lives to try to be better. But all of these ideas, like the dignity of the individual, these come from the Judeo-Christian tradition. And without them, we would be, like China, or like the Islamic world, or like anywhere else. If we had a different tradition in our past, we would be in a different place now. But this was our tradition. This is our tradition. And anyone who thinks that what I've just described is as water is to fish is making a vast category error. This idea that Western civilization is like a cut flower and you can look at it and enjoy it, but it's going to... So how do we make sure that it isn't a cut flower? And the answer to that is, of course, we find the seeds that planted the flowers and we reseed the land. We replant the flowers, the trees and the bushes of our culture and of our civilization. And that's what we should do. That will be part of the task ahead. And that doesn't mean the dogmatic re-Christianization, although some people might like to go that route, but it does mean a recognition of the wellsprings. And, without that, nothing good can come. Without that, we will simply be a flower that withers.
He discusses the potential overlap between the realms of science and religion.
It is a sort of a necessary thing to begin with, which is the issue of the magisteria. We are talking about them separately, but of course the interrelation of them. Whether or not the realms of science and religion are overlapping magisteria or not. And of course, some people would claim that they're absolutely unrelated. We're getting towards, I think, in this discussion, the realization that of course they're overlapping to some degree. We don't know exactly how much. Jonathan probably thinks very significantly. I suspect Jordan thinks to some extent, and I would say to some extent as well. But let me throw out then two issues that I would put as a challenge both for the religious and the non-religious in the discussion that we're heading towards. The first is a challenge for the non-religious, and that's to do with something that Jordan's already talked about, which is the area of ethics and shared values and much more. A great challenge for the non-believers in our age is is that issue of where the values come from. And as Jordan's already suggested, for instance, the Enlightenment, the idea of rationalism, soul rationalism, which not all Enlightenment thinkers were dealing with, but many were. The idea of rationalism being the sole way in which to discern ethics seems to me not to have been embedded very wide or very deep, and may suggest that it's just not possible as a project. So, to quote my late friend Rabbi Jonathan Sachs on this, the idea that ethics are self-evident is self-evidently wrong.
The challenge for believers, he says, is in treating myths or stories as if they hold ultimate truth.
So let me throw that out first as a challenge for the non-believer. Then the challenge for the believer comes down to this thing that Jordan's also already dealt in, which is the issue of, let's say, myth or story. Because we might agree, for instance, that we need a story to agree upon, or a myth to agree upon, or a set of ideas to rely upon and to ground ourselves in. And that doesn't necessarily, of course, by any means lead to the fact that those things are also true. We get into the realm of what Schopenhauer in the Dialogue on Religion, which always made a huge impression on me, deals in, where he says, of course, what he describes as the tragedy of the clergy. That the tragedy of the clergy is that they know the necessity of the thing, they know the truthfulness of the story, in a certain sense of truthfulness, but could never admit, or their job would be over, that that's what it is.
They must navigate their faith as if these stories are not just allegorical, but have real truth claims.
In other words, they have to continue to deal in it as if this is not simply story or unifying myth or anything like that, but is something which has a truth claim behind it. And then let me just say one other thing on that, which is this. The issue of unifying ethic, because it must be what we're sort of somehow also, among other things, as well as trying to define what the true is and what the real is, must be one of the things that we must sort of try to grapple towards. The issue on this seems to me to be, is the Christian ethic, the Christian tradition, to think of it in Hegelian terms, is it an exhausted force or an unexhausted force? This for our age seems to me to be one of the absolutely crucial issues to address. Is it exhausted or unexhausted? I mean, the issue with the Bible, the issue with Christianity, the issue with faith is that it's obviously different. It must be in a different realm. It's clearly in a different realm because it claims different things for itself. Dostoevsky doesn't demand that we believe that Raskolnikov lived. The Bible, if you're going to be a believer, you have to be able to say, in the words of the Creed, that you believe in the virgin birth, that you believe, most importantly, in the resurrection. And as you well know, Jordan, many of us can walk 99% of the way there in terms of belief in the truth of the story. Or as Betjeman puts it, but is it true? Is it true? And then stumble on the last thing.
Douglas acknowledges the particular conundrum raised by the resurrection and its implications for reality.
I don't disagree with that. What Jonathan says about the resurrection and reality, of course, raises a particular conundrum, which is that if you're going to use religion as an explanation of reality, you're also describing the event that subverts reality completely. That the resurrection is the thing that is the least possible thing to do given the world as we understand it. What I'm trying to get to is a sort of, not to diminish it, but having your cake and eating it thing, which is religion explaining reality, reality explained by religion, and also this thing happens that has never been able to happen, and that if you can make that leap, then you've got the faith in religion. I'm not saying that this isn't possible to do. You obviously do it yourself, but it's two things that seem to be in some very, very deep way contradictory. And maybe the contradiction is the point.